One day, perhaps as long as 5,500 years ago, an unknown man settled down with a stone tool on a rocky west-facing slope. Below him lay a spectacular view sweeping down towards the blue waters of what we know today as the Firth of Forth. Painstakingly, he began to carve cup shapes into the rock. Why, we shall never know, possibly to honour his dead ancestors, to fulfil some sacred ritual, or to mark out his land. Whoever he was, for whatever reason he made these marks, he left the first surviving record of human occupation in Corstorphine. This early man may seem unimaginably long ago, but the geological basis of Corstorphine was laid long before his time. Perhaps 1,000,000 years ago, the last ice age melted to form lochs and ridges, and on a ridge between the two vast areas of water, the first settlers made themselves at home. This is the opening paragraph from the book The Corstorphine Story, written by Alison Mackintosh and based on an earlier book written by Miss Rena Cowper titled Historic Corstorphine. The words form an excellent image to start the Corstorphine story. In the 5th century, Christianity reached Scotland, and in the 8th, the Norse invasion began. These two historical phases give us clues about why the area became known as Corstorphine. The earliest record of the name is as Corstorphine, about 1128. This could be 600 years after it first received the name and 300 years before the invention of print began to fix spelling. So the name could have changed a lot since a Christian missionary or a Norse invader first thought it up. There are countless different spellings over the centuries, and each has its effect on what the name might have meant originally. There are three main theories, although plenty of others are possible. It may have been the crossing place from the river over the hill used by a Norse warrior called Thorfinn. It may have been where a religious teacher named Thorfinn set up his Christian cross. Or it may have come from the Gaelic language meaning a white hollow in a wet place, Corstorphine. It is safe to say we will never know. The first mention in history of the place Corstorphine is in a charter dated 1128, when King David I founded the Abbey of Holyrood and attached to it, among other things, the Church of Corstorphine. This church was a tiny building called St Mary's, which stood where the north aisle of the present old parish church stands. History is then silent for over 200 years until 1374, when Adam Forrester became the lord of the manor, and the charter of King Robert II, confirming Adam Forrester's purchase from William More of Abercorn, is still held within the Edinburgh City Archives. Adam Forrester had been Provost of Edinburgh in 1373, and perhaps his devoted interest in the city led him to see that at Corstorphine there was an excellent strategic site for the strengthening of the western defences of the town. In these days, as mentioned earlier, two large bodies of water and much marshy ground lay in the valley to the south of Corstorphine Hill. One in the area now occupied by Ball Green and Carricknow, and one to the west where the railway line to the Forth Bridge now runs. Between these two bodies of water was a narrow piece of dry land, and here in the late 1300s Adam Forrester built a strong defensive castle, which was to be the feature of the landscape for over 300 years, but of what not a vestige remains. This can be explained. When William Dick of Prestonfield, the last owner of the castle, died in 1746, the castle was left to fall into ruin. When the Kirk Session applied to the Dick family for help in repairing the kirkyard dykes, they were told to take the stones from the castle, and no doubt villagers needing stone for cottages and barns also helped in the piecemeal destruction of what Adam Forrester and his descendants had built. However, one building from the castle grounds still survives to this day. It's a dovecot in Dovecot Road, kept by the Forresters to give them fresh pigeon meat in the winter. Inside there are 1,060 nesting boxes or pigeonholes, and yes, That is where today we get the description of a small compartment in a writing desk. The English spy John Harding considered the castle's position worthy of inclusion in the map he drew for Edward IV late in the 15th century, and this map was included in the book The Chronicles of England. This same Laird, Adam Forrester, was responsible for the building which we now have as the old parish church. It is rumoured that the Laird was getting on in years and wanted to settle his burial place. And Adam dedicated his building to St. John the Baptist, and it was positioned close to the then Church of St. Mary. It isn't certain exactly where Adam's chapel was. It could have been at the nave of the present church, or the chancel, or the south aisle, with its altar in the east wall. What is certain is it was probably a very simple building. Adam Forrester died in 1405, and there's a suggestion that he's buried in the old parish church. However, we can't be sure that the effigy in the south aisle really is Sir Adam. The carving of the armour on the effigy is of the style of the mid-15th century, up to 50 years after Adam died. And the forest heraldry on the tomb doesn't help, as it could have been moved there from somewhere else. But whoever he was, there is something rather likeable about this wrinkled, careworn old knight with a dog at his feet. After Adam's death, his son John felt that his father's modest chapel wasn't befitting to the family status, and he aspired to build a collegiate church. This collegiate church was commenced in 1429 and took another 15 years of negotiations with the Pope before he issued a papal bull confirming the institution of the church. The church was formally recognised by the Presbytery of Edinburgh in 1587 as a parish church and has continued in this to the present day. It is interesting to note that if you look at the wall of the kirk on the gable end facing Kirk Lone, you will see high up a small hollow called a niche with a lamp standing in it. This is a modern electric light gifted by the Corstorphine Rotary Club to the church in 1958. When lit on a winter's evening, the light reminds people of the oil lamp that was kept there long ago by the priests to guide travellers across the boggy ground between Edinburgh and Corstorphine. To pay for the lamp oil, the church was given the rent from an acre of ground beside the Water of Leith at Murrayfield. When Sir John Forrester in 1429 began to form a collegiate church, he assigned 3 acres of ground in the village for manses. One of these sites belonged to the prebendary of half Halton and half Dalmahoy, and included the building known as the Dower House, which is still in use today as the headquarters of the Corstorphine Trust. Belief in witches and warlocks was very real in the 17th century. Many a harmless old woman, possibly verging on senility, was done to death because she spoke to herself and kept a cat. The memorable year for witchcraft in Corstorphine was 1649. A detailed account survives in the pages of the Kirk Session records. On the 13th of May, Beatrix Watson, wife of the weaver Alexander Scott, lodged a bill of complaint against the schoolmaster James Chalmers, because he had accused her of being a witch. Fellow villagers, speaking on oath before the minister of the Kirk Session, told strange stories of the accused. Marion Weir described how Beatrix had gone into Cochrane's house and scolded Cochrane's wife Jean. The next day, Jean was struck by a mysterious illness. Sometimes she was excessively hot, and sometimes chittering for cold. This lasted for 3 days, when the poor woman became speechless, and when any did lift up her hands, they fell down incontinent. On the 4th day, Beatrix visited the sick woman, and pitter-pattered some words. Marion Weir, the servant, was lying in the bed beyond her mistress, when suddenly a large black thing, a great rotten, or rat, came from under the bedclothes, and jumped up on the bedstead. After a deep sleep, the afflicted woman woke up and was able to speak. After many other villagers had spoken, Lord Forrester's baillie, James Haddon, imprisoned Beatrix in the tower of the kirk, where she remained till the 25th of May, when she managed to hang herself rather than face the fire. A further 5 women and 1 man were tried for witchcraft. From May until September 1649, the witch trials occupied the minster and the kirk session. By the following year, Cromwell was in Scotland, and the Cromwellian government was more tolerant of witches, and so persecution abated. In 1753, the laws against witchcraft were repealed. As previously stated, Oliver Cromwell advanced into Scotland in 1650, and the Scots, under David Leslie, prepared to meet the English army. On the 11th of August, Cromwell encamped on the Braid Hills south of Edinburgh, and by August the 18th, Leslie had drawn up his forces on Corstorphine Meadow, looking across the valley to the English. On Corstorphine Hill he placed a detachment with 2 guns. His headquarters were at Corstorphine Castle. On the 27th of August, Cromwell turned west towards Queensferry, and Leslie at once moved to intercept the English at Gogar. There it was, as Cromwell wrote in a letter dated the 30th of August, the vanguards of both armies came to skirmish, upon a place where bogs and passes made the access to each army of the other difficult. We, being ignorant of the place, drew up, hoping to have engaged, but found no way feasible. We drew up our cannon, and did that day discharge 200 or 300 great shot upon them. A considerable number they likewise returned to us. This was the engagement known as the Field of the Flashes, the gunfire having caused the greatest attention. It took place on ground within the estates of Gogarburn and the now demolished Hanley House, which became Gogarburn Hospital. One of the fields near Hanley House is called Skirmish. Cromwell withdrew from the action. For the next 10 years, the country was under English military rule. English troops took over Corstorphine Castle and the kirk, destroying much of the estate and damaging the church. When the Cromwellian soldiers departed in 1651, George, First Lord Forester, returned to the castle. The direct Forester line ended in 1650, when John, the Master of Forester, only son of George, the First Lord Forester, died, without leaving an heir. George married off his daughter Jean to the eldest son of the Letham family, known as James, who then became the laird. Over the coming years, James proceeded to be the sort of laird who would give the landed gentry a bad name. Locals admitted adultery with him, and one named him as father of her child. It was his womanizing that brought James to a sticky end. Excerpt from the minute of the Corstorphine Kirk session, 22nd of January, 1679. This day was advice of the session required about James Lord Forester and Christian Hamilton, spouse to Andrew Nimmo, their living and cohabitating in one house together, as also anent his fall in fornication with one Bessie Ritchie. It was an extraordinary situation for the time, not unusual for a parishioner to be called before the session on a charge of fornication, but this was the laird. How they must have debated and dreaded taking such a step. To make matters worse, Christian was James' niece, and the previous year she had borne a daughter to James, also called Christian. After the restoration of Charles II in 1660, James, second Lord Forester, appears to have had financial troubles, and to become a heavy drinker. He began to tire of his love affair with his niece Christian. However, Christian was not prepared to let him go, and so feelings were running high, and on the 26th of August 1679, when James Forester made his way to the local inn known as the Black Bull, Christian made her way to Corstorphine to speak to her lover. The Black Bull Inn was one of Forester's house. It stood at the corner of the High Street in Hall Terrace. Here it was that James was drinking with his cronies when word came to him that Christian was awaiting him at the castle. When eventually he left, he met her under the spreading branches of the now famous sycamore tree. This ancient sycamore or plane tree stood beside the dovecot for over 4 centuries. Tradition credits its origin to a sapling brought from the east by a monk in the early 15th century. It is more probable that it is 16th century relic of the avenue of trees that led to Corstorphine Castle. This avenue was an eastern approach to the castle on what is now Saughton Road. The Details of the quarrel were not known, but reasonable conjectures may be made. James had other loves, as the Kirk Session minutes reveal. Whatever the cause, Christian killed Forrester with his own sword. Terrified, Christian hid in the castle, but was found and taken to the Talbot jail in Edinburgh. Thinking quickly, she claimed to be pregnant, but this was found to be a lie. Still not beaten, on the 29th of September, dressed as a man, she escaped from the Talbot jail. However, next day she was recaptured at Fala Mill, brought back to Edinburgh, and sentenced to death. Christian faced her execution with courage. She must have made a dramatic figure, emerging from her cell wearing a white taffeta hood, baring her shoulders, herself ready for the axe. Christian's wearing of the white taffeta hood may explain the legend that has grown up of a woman in white, bloody sword in hand, wandering and wailing round the pigeon house and sycamore tree. Mention was made earlier of the Corstorphine Trust headquarters within the Dower House. This house stands in the northeast corner of St Margaret's Park and has a history going back at least 4 centuries. The lime-harrowed building has characteristic Scottish crow-stepped gables and scrolled skew-putts. Renes's moulding is a feature of the entrance, above which is the moulded border where our armorial would once have been. Here is a house and ground with a line of ownership from the prebendary James Ingall's 1587 to the City of Edinburgh 1923. Education in Corstorphine may have begun in 1429, when Dame Margaret Forrester provided funding for 2 singing boys in the parish church. The boys were probably taught to understand the Latin words they sang. However, education for all was a long way off, and even by 1496 was limited to providing education for the eldest sons of gentlemen. It was 1646 before the new Act ordered the locally funded church supervised school to be established in every parish in Scotland, and in September that year comes the first recorded name of a schoolmaster, James Chalmers in Corstorphine. The school was entirely controlled by the church, and often the schoolmaster was also the session clerk. Up to 1819, the school in the village was a thatched cottage in the High Street. After this date, the school moved to its present site, and even to this day, the building continues to expand. When the school was built in 1819, it needed the ground on which stood the Birket cross of the village. This was not the usual Scottish stone pillar cross. It was indeed 5 elm trees, under which the villagers bought and sold cattle, horses, hens, etc. When these trees were cut down, the headmaster at the time was to replace them nearby. He did not do so. However, in 1987, the City of Edinburgh District Council Parks Department replaced the 5 trees in St Margaret's Park opposite the school. An event took place on the 4th of August 1789, which indicates the growing standard of living among even a small community, such as the Corstorphine of that time. On that day, a body of villagers met together for the purpose of taking under our serious consideration the many bales and calamities to which mankind are liable through the courses of this life. We do propose, under the blessings of God, to establish a fund in order to the relief of ourselves and the brethren in time of necessity under the following regulations. Thus was born an institution that had great influence in the villagers for more than 100 years. It was to be called the Corstorphine Friendly Society, and had for its motto, for ourselves and for all. The Corstorphine Friendly Society had for its motto, for ourselves and for all. The original draft of the Society articles, part of the manuscript of which is still in existence, set out that everyone who is admitted to this society be of decent character. None be admitted who is of weak or sickly constitution, or who has known trouble or distemper. Every person whom desires to be admitted shall give full proof of his honesty and sobriety. Contributions in the beginning were 2 and 6pence, followed by a 1 shilling per quarter payment. The articles also stated that there shall be a proper box belonging to the society where money, books, and papers shall be kept. The box shall be put in the hand of a reputable person who shall find sufficient caution, and the said money, books, and papers shall be safe. The first colours or banner of the society was purchased in 1808, and in 1827 a second banner was bought. These banners, the latter in fragile condition, along with the original box, are still in existence and can be seen within the Dower House Museum. Each year, usually on the first Wednesday in June, the society met for its annual dinner, after which the colours, the old and the new, were roped, and the highest bidder was given the honour of leading the procession of members, headed by a pipe band, and visiting various houses in the parish where they obtained donations for the fund. The Friendly Society received an unusual request in 1849 from a gentleman called Cumberland Hill, who had been with the society for nearly 50 years. Mr. Hill and his wife, by then in their 70s, had decided to emigrate and live with their son at the Cape of Good Hope colony. He needed £5 for the journey, and suggested in his letter that since he and his wife would eventually be entitled to funeral payments totalling £7, it would save the society money to give him the £5 now. He finished his letter with the statement, "I shall trouble you no more." Fortunately, the society saw the sense of this, and Mr. Hill got his £5, emigrated with his wife to South Africa, and their descendants still live there to this day. The society was wound up in 1927. In July 1864, Mr. William Seaton Brown of Preston Pans offered to build a convalescence home on the understanding that the manager of the Royal Infirmary would maintain it thereafter. This bequest was in memory of his two brothers, both doctors, who died comparatively young men. The building was designed by the architects Messer Kinnear and Peedy, and the final cost on completion was £12,000. The building was formally opened and handed over to the managers of the Royal Infirmary in 1867 and provided accommodation for 50 patients. In 1893, as a result of a bequest by a Mr. Naismith, 2 wings were added which provided a further 40 beds. Sadly, the hospital closed in 2014. In the mid-18th century, the biggest tourist attraction in Corstorphine was the Physic Well, and stagecoaches came from Edinburgh every day and 4 times on a Sunday, bringing people of fashion to take the waters. The well had been a place of healing for centuries before it became fashionable. In 1550, Mary of Guise, the mother of Mary Queen of Scots, advised a French general to try it, and lent mules and a litter to get him there. He later wrote her a very grateful letter saying the cure had been a wonderful success. In 1740, John Wilson, an Edinburgh merchant, built a large house in the High Street to accommodate the visitors. He grandly named it the Mansion House. When the house was finally demolished in 1952, a stone lintel was found, possibly from the old castle. The shields and initials may commemorate the marriage of Henry Forrester and Helen Preston. Scottish village life up until 1914-18 war owed much to 3 men in public office: the minister, the teacher, and the doctor. It is to the doctor that Corstorphine is indebted for its village library. In 1854, Dr. Fowler presented 100 books for the benefit of local people. Though in name a subscription library, the committee readily gave access to those unable to pay. By the 1880s, there were 100 subscribers and a collection of 4,000 volumes. When the 19th century closed, the concept of free public libraries had been accepted. Accordingly, in 1901, Corstorphine Parish Council approached the directors of the recently completed public hall with a view to purchasing the land to the east of the hall on which a public library could be built. Andrew Carnegie gave £1,000 towards this venture. It was perhaps fortunate for the village that Carnegie's secretary at the time was a Corstorphine lad, James Bertram. The library, designed to complete the frontage of the public hall and built in the Scottish baronial style, was opened in 1904. By 1907, the yearly issue of books was then 10,500. In 1920, control of the library passed to Edinburgh Public Libraries Committee. By 1887, Corstorphine even had its own Burns Club, celebrating its annual Burns Supper in the Harp Hotel. Those invited had to respond to the invitation in verse. In 1904, the club was presented with a carved oak chest in which to store its minute books and papers. This chest was made with the wood from the Edinburgh home of Burns's great friend and fellow poet Alan Ramsay. This box and contents can also be seen in the Dower House Museum. Village life in the early part of the 19th century must have been similar to that of most Scottish villages for the period. A self-supporting community, knowing plenty of hard work during daylight hours for very low wages, but no doubt in many ways a happy life with few worries. The census of 1841 shows that in the village area around the High Street there were 372 persons living in 85 inhabited houses. Of the 193 males and 179 females, only 15 men and 18 women were over the age of 60, the oldest being 82. The community was self-contained, with agricultural labourers forming the largest group of workers. There were also many market gardens, including those at Meadow Place, Ladywell, Woodbine and Fairy Bank, which not only supplied the village but also the City of Edinburgh. There were masons, thatchers, weavers, 4 master tailors, 2 shoemakers, 1 dancing master, and of course those who supplied the basic needs of food, 3 grocers, 2 bakers, and a butcher or flesher, whose premises were in the High Village, now known as St John's Road. The professions were represented by the minister, 2 doctors, an architect, and a teacher. There were many farms surrounding the village, and these no doubt drew much of their labour from the village, in addition to that which lived in the cotter houses attached to the farmsteadings. Another kind of labourer also resided in the village at Irish Corner, where there were many people of Irish origin attracted to this part of Scotland by the work to be found in the construction of the Union Canal and the Edinburgh to Glasgow railway line. As mentioned earlier, 20th century Corstorphine, as an agricultural community, contained a large number of market gardens. 1912 saw the first students graduate from a unique college, the Edinburgh School of Gardening for Women. This was established by 2 ladies, Miss Barker and Miss Morrison, to provide training and subsequent employment for women. The school was set up on Kames Road, close to Corstorphine Hill Farm, just north of the present Old Kirk Road. One of the school's early graduates was the writer Madge Elder, who got her first job as gardener to Lady Chalmers at Fox Covert. The school closed after the First World War, but Miss Barker continued to run the site as a garden, specialising in alpines and rock plants, until she died in 1929. Although Corstorphine had no large-scale industry, there were craft industries. The earliest and undoubtedly the most celebrated was the dovecot tapestries. At the turn of the century, the 3rd Marquess of Bute, inspired by the craft work of the poet and artist William Morris, decided to establish a weaving workshop in Scotland. He died before his plan could be realised, but his son went on with the project, and in 1910 the building of a workshop beside Corstorphine's medieval dovecot was begun. 2 years later, Gordon Berry and John Glassbrook, experienced weavers from the Morris workshops at Merton Abbey, along with 4 local apprentices, started in the first great pictorial tapestry. Glassbrook and Berry went to Corstorphine from Corstorphine to the Great War. Tragically, neither returned, and their names are commemorated on the village war memorial. Weaving stopped at the Dovecot Studios in 2000, and in 2008 the studios moved to the centre of Edinburgh to the former swimming baths in Infirmary Street. The Corstorphine Trust is very lucky to have in its collection a dovecot tapestry entitled Fishing Birds. This tapestry was woven by Harry Wright as his apprentice piece. Harry subsequently went on to become the principal weaver at the studio. Fishing Birds was purchased at auction in 1950 by Mr. and Mrs. Robert Fulton, who lived in Dovecot Road. Mrs. Anne Fulton kindly gifted the tapestry to the Corstorphine Trust in the summer of 2012. The tapestry is now on permanent display in the Davis Room of the Dower House. The zoo opened in July 1913. For 5 years, the Zoological Society of Edinburgh had been searching for a site, and the owner of Corstorphine Hill House, a Mr. Macmillan of the tea family Melrose, was willing to sell the Zoological Society an area of 74 acres for the sum of £17,000. This was accepted, and they gave themselves 15 weeks to get things in order to open. Soon residents would marvel at the sight of lions, bears and leopards arriving in crates at Corstorphine station. The zoo brought visitors to Corstorphine on a scale never experienced before. It also resulted in an extension to the existing tram network. An article appeared in the Scotsman newspaper on Monday the 2nd of August 1915, and it read as follows. An interesting event in Corstorphine's history took place on Saturday afternoon when Mr. Christopher Douglas Brown of Inverallen House presented a handsome public park to the village in which he spent his boyhood years. The park at Corstorphine will supply what has long been a felt want, as it will provide a pleasant place for recreation for the young and old, and will also form a suitable resort for visitors. The park is situated in a central position and is just across the road from the public school. The park, as it has been opened, extends to 5 3/4 acres, and at the expiry of the lease of adjoining ground in 1918, another 2 3/4 acres will be added. As the ground was formerly under agricultural, the laying out of the park has entailed a great amount of labour, and it has been calculated that 3,000 cartloads of soil have been deposited within its borders. The result has been a very handsome, pleasing, and already the grass and turf look well. A handsome park lodge house and entrance gate have been erected, whilst a large number of young trees have already been planted. These form a border to the walk which cuts centrally across the park. This has led to the established park we see today. A great change took place in the life of Corstorphine on the implementation of the Edinburgh Corporation Boundary Extension Act of 1920. Previously, the parish council had been responsible to Midlothian County Council for services such as education and libraries. Although there were advantages such as improved transport, gas, water and electric supplies, the inhabitants lost a great deal of the control they had exercised through having their own elected members on the parish council. However much local councillors over the years have endeavoured to out the views of Corstorphine before Edinburgh Town Council, inevitably they have had to compete with the rival claims of other districts. In 1992, Corstorphine's very own local historian signed off her 300,000 life work with thoughts of what has gone from Corstorphine and what is left. The ancient families are gone, the Foresters, Dickies, McPhees. Many of the old houses have gone, the Castle, Clemerson House, the Mansion House. So what remained? Our conclusion is that Corstorphine retains its spirit of community, the mutual kindness which Reverend James Oliver noted in 1791. In spirit, it is still a village. For those of us who live there, and for those of us who have ever lived there, it is a very precious community of neighbours and friends. And this has been ably demonstrated during this past year, a year which most of the villagers will never forget. I would like to acknowledge the vital work and research carried out by the late Miss Rena Cowper, Mrs. Alison McIntosh, and the present Corstorphine Trust archivist, Mrs. Frances McRae. Thanks also to Jane Kerr and Tristan Craig for their technical knowledge and support in putting this material together. My name is Ian McRae, and at present I hold the position of the Corstorphine Trust storyteller. Many thanks for listening.